This morning in John's Gospel, we're going to look at the concept of human identity. Specifically in John chapter 5, Jesus is in a conversation with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees had made a man made system wherein they were competing with one another to exceed each other's piety and status in the community. Now, around our world, we have different cultures, and many of those cultures have similar identity traits. Some cultures may be more materialistic in nature and more individualistic in nature, oftentimes giving higher value to individual freedom. In those cultures, such as the one that I am from, I live in Kentucky, USA, oftentimes we can fall into the trap of measuring one another's worth on the basis of the possessions we have or the achievements that we have accumulated. In other cultures around the world, while those things are still present there, but those cultures are more communal in nature, it can be a trap that people will base their value on the significance of the person they can have into their home, or that they can have more influence in the community itself. Whether you fall into one side or the other, Jesus here says that if you base your value and your worth on either of these different cultural traits, you will have diminished glory as a human being. That is, he's saying we were made for so much more. We were made to live for the glory of God. That is something that no human level worth can give to us, and it's something that only God can give to us, and Jesus says we already possess. Join me this morning as we go deeper into John's Gospel. Always keeping it fresh here at the People Scholar. Welcome to the People Scholar YouTube channel. My name is Dr. Jay Williams. I'd like to welcome you to our Bible study in John's Gospel. This morning, we're going to be carrying through and finishing chapter 5. That is, we're going to be looking at verses 30 through 47. Now, when we think about human identity, we often think about those things around us that shape our worth. Now, in a Western context, which is where I'm recording from, Kentucky, USA, we often can define ourselves or be pulled into the trap of defining ourselves on the basis of our possessions. That is, the person who has the most toys wins at the end of the day. That is a common idea that has been held for many years in Western cultures. And the trap of that type of thinking is that when your possessions dwindle, or when your possessions are taken from you, whether through sickness or death, ultimately, as Solomon talks about in the book of Ecclesiastes, all of those things prove themselves to be empty and vain in the end. In our text this morning, Jesus takes us to a deeper level of thinking. That is, it is a deception. It is a lie that our value is based on material things. Our value is based upon the fact that we were made by an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-present God who made us in his very likeness. Human beings throughout history have done glorious things because we were made with inherent glory that has its roots in God himself. And Jesus is going to show us this morning that if your identity and your glory is placed in human level things or material possessions, at the end of the day, it's pretty shallow. We were made for so much more. So join me now as we dive deeper into John chapter 5. Now, as we carry on in John chapter 5, beginning in verse 30, we read this. Jesus again having this conversation with the Pharisees. I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. There is another who bears witness about me, and I know that the testimony that he bears about me is true. You sent to John, and he has borne witness to the truth. Not that the testimony that I receive is from man, But I say these things so that you may be saved. He was a burning and shining lamp, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. But the testimony that I have is greater than that of John. For the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you have never heard, his form you have never seen, and you do not have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe the one whom he has sent. You search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me, yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. I do not receive glory from people, but I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? Do not think I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? Right away, Jesus digs into human identity. He did not come to be a monument builder in and of himself. In everything that Jesus did, he was using a human form to teach us about the heart of God, but also to teach us how we relate to God. That is, Jesus says here in verses 30 through 31 that he can do nothing of himself. In other words, he did not come to take matters into his own hands, even though he could have. He was the eternal Son of God. Jesus came to obey the will of the Father, so that in everything he did, he modeled what the perfect human life looks like. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean that Jesus' identity, modeled after the work and heart of the Father, would reflect what the perfect human life looks like? Well, it would be the perfect human life because human beings were made in the image of God. That is, we were designed to reflect the glory of God in a smaller form. Jesus obeying the Father perfectly then becomes an example of the perfection of God the Father being communicated through a human body. Now, we all do this in different ways. We do this individually and collectively. The amazing thing about the human experience is that all of us come into this world as learners. And who we become is predicated on a long line of influences that have come into our life, both in our physical reality, that is through who we meet, our parents raising us, the experiences we have where our bodies are moving through this physical world, and in a non-physical sense, in the sense of who we read, the ideas that flow through our minds and that shape us and how we think. All of those things together make up who we become. Now, fascinating then, when we think about who we are not an island unto ourselves. The collective human experience in various shapes and various forms who we become in our identity. So Jesus here is really doing the same thing, except for he is pointing us back to the source of all knowledge and wisdom. He's saying your identity is truest when it aligns with the heart and mind of God. Jesus himself saying, everything that you see me doing is not in and of itself just of me. I'm doing the will of the Father who sent me, so that when you look on me, you see the Father. That's a fascinating concept. That is, you reflect on who you are and you think of all the people that have came and went through your life, the experiences you've had, the books that you've read, the shows that you've watched, all of the voices, all of that information that has passed through your senses and through your mind has really shaped who you are. And that is a very clear indicator of a God reality. We are individuals, and yet we are a collective. There is unity in diversity. There is individuals, and then there's the collective made up of each individual mind. That points us back to the Trinity, that God is three, and yet he is one. There is unity in diversity in the very person of God. One of the great rock stars of the Enlightenment is a German philosopher by the name of Leibniz. Leibniz really was a rock star before rock stars existed. Why do I say that? Well, when you have hair like this individual, you automatically are classified as a rock star for those of us who grew up in the 80s. Speaking to this concept, Leibniz writes that this is a proof of God. He says, never has a system so clearly proved our high standing, that is, as human beings. Every spirit being like a separate world, sufficient to itself, independent of every other creature, enclosing the infinite, expressing the universe, is as durable, as stable, and as absolute as the universe of creatures itself. Therefore, we ought always to appear in it in the best way fitted to contribute to the perfection of the society of all spirits, which makes their moral union in the city of God. Here is found also a new proof of the existence of God, which is one of surprising clearness. For this perfect harmony of so many substances which have no communication with each other can only come from a common cause. Jesus is affirming that statement. Jesus was a human. That is, he experienced life in the same way that we experience life. He was born into this world through the Virgin Mary. He bumped his knee. He learned how to work with his hands. He learned language in the sense that every one of us has to learn through. And at the same time, he was the Son of God. And the Father communicated to him directly in a way that only the eternal Father can communicate with the eternal Son. We see that in the knowledge that Jesus had of events going on all around the world that he wasn't living in close proximity. So we have something very unique going on in the person of Jesus. But Jesus is addressing the Pharisees and the scribes, and he's saying to them that even though they have all this knowledge and wisdom, they had lost track of living a life for the glory of God, and they were living a life merely to find glory from one another. We see that in many different answers he gives them. In verses 32 through 33, Jesus says immediately, "When John was here, he testified about me, and you did not believe him. But you did listen to John. That is, you trusted him as an authority." And yet, Jesus is saying John was using all of that knowledge to speak of my coming. Then in verses 36 through 38, Jesus says that the miracles that I have performed not only show the power that I have, which no other human being has, but they testify that God is working through me, because unless God was present, there's no way an individual could do the things that I've been doing. So he says, you're not even recognizing these miracles, the power that I possess, that they come from God and not just from me. Then Jesus says, you are the scholars. You're the ones who study the Old Testament. You're the academics of our age who understand the knowledge that has happened through God's communication with humanity in history up until this point. And yet you don't even believe the authors whom you claim to be authorities when they testify about me. Jesus says, you don't even believe Moses, who testified about me in the Old Testament. That, of course, is that text in Deuteronomy where Moses testifies that God would send a prophet similar to Moses who would lead the people out of true bondage, out of the bondage of sin. What was the underlying motive for that? They were rooting their identity in human level glory. Jesus says this in verse 42 through 44. But I know that you do not have the love of God within you. That is, if you loved God, you would seek glory from God and not from men. I have come in my Father's name. That is, he wasn't coming for his own glory. He was coming to give glory to the Father and to live his life as the Father directed him. And you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. That is, you receive John, who was merely a human. John didn't do miracles. He preached the message of the coming of the Messiah. So they trusted in him as a person who comes in his own name. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? In closing, Jesus then says, if you do not believe the scriptures that clearly foretold who I'd be, or the works that I do, or the voices that have been collectively speaking about me, then nothing that happens will convince you, and you will not believe. So what can we learn from this today? Well, where do we place our identity? Do we place it in the glory of man, where we seek to be recognized by our peers, where we seek to have positions of power or wealth, or to have the most influential guests into our home, or be most respected in our community? None of those things are inherently bad in themselves, but when we make them the object of our worship, we can guarantee that we're not going to place our identity in God, and we're not going to bring glory to God. We're going to only seek glory for ourselves. But as Jesus clearly modeled for us and tells us, that kind of life does not lead to human flourishing. In fact, it can lead to tyranny, as we see in the lives of the Pharisees, who could not even recognize the miracle of Jesus healing a man who had been paralyzed for 38 years, and to see the compassion of God in that. Where can that hard-heartedness lead us? That's a question that each one of us has to answer for ourselves. Until next time, thank you for joining me, and please like and subscribe if this channel is a blessing to you.